Okay, here's the cast of main characters for this show. We'll finish the career of Roger van der Weyden and see the Bone and St. Columba altarpieces. Hugo van der Goes is now considered one of the greatest artists of the Northern Renaissance, although he died insane at about 40. We'll see his masterpiece, the Portinari altarpiece. Hans Memling used to be regarded as the greatest of the so-called Flemish primitives, and we'll see several things by him, but his stock has fallen in the last few decades, and his work is now considered sentimental, dull. If you're planning a nap during this program, art historians would probably recommend the Memling portion of the lecture for that. After the break, we'll hear about Charles the Bold and King Louis XI of France, two of the most interesting political personalities of the era. Philippe de Comines is the most important biographer of both of these fellows and the most important historian of their day in Northern Europe. And we'll of course hear a lot of music. Today by, among others, Johannes Ockeghem, who was born in Flanders but spent most of his career at the court of France. We've already seen two very important works of art commissioned by Philip the Good's Chancellor Nicholas Rollin. The picture by Van Eyck in the Louvre showing him alone with the Madonna and Child, and then the Hotel Dieu in Beaune, and here he is again on one of the shutters of the altarpiece he had made by Roger van der Weyden to be displayed behind the altar in the Salle des Pauvres, the main room in the infirmary of the Hotel Dieu. This giant altarpiece is now displayed in an atmospherically controlled and darkened room, very different from the Salle des Pauvres. Usually I like to see works of art where they were intended to be seen, but in this case the new setting has the effect of eliminating distractions and focusing our attention on the altarpiece itself in a way it would be hard to complain about. Here you can see the whole front as it would have looked closed on ordinary days, with Rollin at the left and his wife Guigon at the right. In between them are St. Sebastian and St. Anthony in grisaille. Remember, to do something in grisaille is to make it look like unpainted sculpture. The altarpiece has actually been cut apart, so the front paintings and interior paintings, which we'll get to in a minute, can be seen at the same time. These two saints, Anthony and Sebastian, were often associated with hospitals. Sebastian is the patron of those suffering from wounds, and Anthony is the patron of those suffering from sickness. Sebastian is always easy to recognize by the arrows sticking into him, and Anthony can be identified by his pet pig, the bell he used to call it, and his taw-shaped crutch, taw-shaped because it looks like the Greek letter taw, like a flat-topped T or cross. Now you can see the altarpiece the way it would look open on special feast days. The subject is loosely based on the Apocalypse, the book of the Revelation of St. John. The rainbow, which is said to surround the Lord's throne, has the Virgin Mary at one end and John the Baptist at the other, and together with the Lord they make up the group known as the Deesis, which was also in the center of Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, you may remember. Christian heroes, more or less playing the role of the 24 elders in the Apocalypse, sit behind Mary on one side and John on the other. Below the Lord stands St. Michael, traditionally but not scripturally assigned the role of weighing the souls of the dead. In van der Weyden's altarpiece here, the damned sink as though weighed down by sin, while the saved rise, but sometimes, as in the case of his pupil Memling's work, which we'll see later, one sees the saved sinking as though heavy with virtue while the damned rise. The important thing to remember is that the saved are always in the pan on Michael's right, whether it goes up or down, so I'd advise you to jump right in there as soon as possible when you get the chance. It might seem that the Last Judgment would have been a sort of intimidating rather than comforting subject for patients in a hospital, but it's in the spirit of Thomas à Kempis's view that we should think of every day as our last. Those in the hospital could confess and be secure in the knowledge that they probably couldn't commit any further sins and could look forward to the certainty of ultimate salvation. Virtually all Christian art, like this altarpiece, does presuppose the resurrection of the body, which does, despite the fact that it brings up some difficult questions, seem like a good idea to me, and it is the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. Here's Michael up closer. The altarpiece is now set up in such a way that a kind of giant magnifying glass moves back and forth in front of it so that some of the details can be seen better. In lieu of that, we'll see some photos of some of the details, and hear the Messe au Travail Suisse by Johannes Ockeghem. This is a setting of the Mass based on the tune of the popular song Au Travail Suisse, which means something like, I'm hard at work, or I'm suffering, perhaps, idiomatically. As I've said before, it was not uncommon to use such popular songs in this way, strange as it might seem. Ockeghem was born about 1430 in Flanders, but spent most of his career, as I mentioned in the introduction, working for the Royal Chapel in Paris. He died in 1495. Among the heroes to the left of the Virgin are probably the Pope Eugenius IV, whom you may remember presided at the consecration of the Cathedral of Florence last quarter. And behind him with the bishop's mitre is John Chevreul, the Bishop of Tournai, who was a close friend, as we've heard, of both Roland and Philip the Good. In front of Chevreul is Charles VII, and next to him is Philip the Good himself. Here's the Virgin up closer. And John the Baptist at the other side. And above are the angels with the instruments of the Passion. Now we see van der Weyden's St. Columba altarpiece on display in the Munich Alte Pinakothek. This was long displayed in the Church of St. Columba in Cologne, and the Magi were always popular in Cologne because the cathedral has their relics, but I'm pretty sure that Philip the Good and his son Charles are in the central panel here, which suggests someone in Burgundy may have paid for it, or perhaps just that van der Weyden wanted to honor Charles and Philip by giving them the parts of the Magi here. The three parts of the triptych depict what are sometimes called the three presentations, the presentation of Jesus to Mary at the Annunciation, to the world represented by the Magi in the center, and to the church represented by the presentation in the temple to St. Simeon in the right panel. In this close-up of the central panel, you can see Philip's son Charles the Bold at the right, or else someone who looks a lot like him. We'll see Van der Weyden's portrait of him later, and I think it's also possible that the middle magus at the left here in red is his half-brother Anthony, Le Grand Bâtard de Bourgogne, the great bastard of Burgundy, Philip's illegitimate son. And Charles is, as I say, half-brother, but he does not, I admit, look much like the fellow in the presumed portrait of Anthony by Van der Weyden we'll also see later. In this close-up, I think it's likely we see Philip the Good as the oldest magus. He at least looks enough like other pictures of Philip to have that suggestion be considered anyway. The countryside and cityscape in the distance in this panel are among the most attractive of the whole 15th century. And the picture is so perfectly painted and is in such perfect shape after 550 years that it has to count as one of the most beautiful surviving 15th century altarpieces. Notice that the donkey seems to pay no attention while the cow seems more interested. The tradition developed in the north that the cow did realize the Savior had been born and mooed soothingly to help lull the baby to sleep, while the ignorant donkey just brayed and ate. This is a portrait by Van der Weyden now in Berlin, thought to be of his wife. Whoever she is one of several beautiful women he painted. This is another in the London National Gallery. Oscar Wilde says, "Beauty is the rarest form of genius." I don't really know exactly what he means by that, but real beauty is probably as rare as genius, and like genius, it's not something you can acquire on your own. It's pretty much a thing you have to be given. The 15th century fashion for, at its most extreme, plucking all hair off the face, creates an almost alien look that only flatters perfection. Here's still another beauty by Van der Weyden in the Washington National Gallery. I think it's just possible that this woman is the illegitimate daughter of Philip the Good. In any case, she looks enough like the fellow we'll see later, who is alleged to be his illegitimate son Anthony, that they could be twins. She also looks a lot like she could be the sister of the woman we just saw, but fashion does make people look alike. Here she is up closer. I think if there'd been a Miss Renaissance contest in her day, she would have gotten a lot of votes. This is now the Hôtel de Ville in Louvain, built between 1447 and 1467 by an architect named Mathieu de Layenne. We saw the slightly earlier Hôtel de Ville in Brussels last time, as well as the still earlier 14th century one in Bruges a couple of weeks ago. All of these are in the Gothic style, which, as we saw last quarter, made almost no impact on Italian secular architecture, outside Venice anyway. By the middle of the 15th century in Italy, the Gothic style had been long given up, even for churches. I think we could almost regard a building like this as the architectural equivalent to a manuscript illumination, or a painting by Van Eyck or Van der Weyden. The emphasis is on details and on trying to overpower us with virtuoso technique, as it were. I mentioned last time that the pictures which Van der Weyden's contemporaries thought were his best were his so-called justice pictures in the Brussels Hôtel de Ville. Most town halls had similar pictures which were meant to inspire truth and fairness, in the legal business that went on in them, and Dirk Bouts did the justice pictures for this building. This is one of these pictures now in the Brussels Musée des Beaux-Arts. It's called the Justice of Otto. According to the Golden Legend, the wife of the Emperor Otto II falsely accused a fellow of attempting to seduce her. Otto then had the fellow beheaded, but the man's wife, who was convinced of his innocence, appeared at the court with his head and offered to undergo a trial to prove it. She picked up one of those red-hot iron bars you see there out of the barbecue at the bottom of the picture, and her truthfulness, and presumably the deserved protection of the Lord, saved her from getting burned and convinced the emperor also of her husband's innocence. Realizing an injustice had been done, he then burned his wife at the stake for having made this false accusation, as you can see in the upper part of the picture there. This picture illustrates very well the problem so many Renaissance painters had getting beyond realistic details to the creation of a convincing whole picture. The clothes and the skin of the subjects are masterpieces of technical virtuosity, but the emotional tone of the picture rings completely false. Here you can see a couple of the actors up closer. If a woman walked into my office with a man's head under her arm, I think I'd be a little more startled than Otto and his friends seem to be. Their gestures are mechanical and they come off looking like robots for all the amazing realism of the painter's work. The Legion of Honor in San Francisco has a picture of the Madonna and Child attributed to Bouts, which you can see here. Bouts is not as well known as Van Eyck or Van der Weyden, but for a time at least, his version of the Resurrection held the record for the highest price ever paid for a painting auctioned by Sotheby's, $3.7 million back in 1980. It was bought by Jennifer Jones and is now in the Norton Simon Museum. This is the Chateau of Larn, which was once the home of Baudouin de Vaux, Charles the Bold's representative in Ghent. It is, significantly, outside the city walls because it was too dangerous for the fellow to live inside the city. The administration of Philip and his son Charles was not universally popular, and there were many in Flanders who regarded them as little better than foreign French tyrants. The large middle class in places like Ghent very much resented the financial demands made on them, in return for which they got nothing but the dubious glory of being subjects of the Duke of Burgundy. Here's another view of the castle. You may remember that Philip van Artevelde of Ghent was one of the main opponents of Philip the Bold, the first in the line of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy and Counts of Flanders, and was killed at Rysbeck trying to prevent him from taking over his Flemish inheritance. The 15th century historian Philippe de Comines, about whom we'll hear more shortly, called the Gantois, the people of Ghent, the most rebellious people in Europe. This is the interior of the Chateau de Larn. Since it's usually about Halloween when I give this lecture, I'll tell you about the ghost of this place. The story goes that one night, a guest of Baudouin's was awakened by the sound of someone opening a secret safe in the wall. This ghostly person got a bag of gold coins out, counted them, and put them back, and then vanished into thin air. The guest got up, opened the safe himself, took the gold, and left with it. It is said now that every once in a while the ghost returns looking for his bag of gold, and the implication is that you don't want to be there on those nights. Like most ghost stories, it doesn't stand up well to much scrutiny, but the current owners leave a bag of gold out for him to count just in case. Here is Ghent as it looks today from the air. At the right center is St. Bavo's, where we saw the Ghent altarpiece, the Adoration of the Lamb by Van Eyck. In front of it is the scaffolded belfry. The town hall or Hotel de Ville is just across the square to the north. To the west of the belfry is the Church of St. Nicholas, and across the river Lya, or Lys, is St. Michael's. St. Bavo's and St. Michael's have the typical Flemish single tower on the facade, while St. Nicholas has the English-style crossing tower. These churches are not especially interesting as works of art, but there's an interesting memorial in St. Nicholas to one Olivier Manceau, who was the father, it is said, of 31 children. There is, however, no mention made of his wife who bore these 31 children. At the extreme left, you can see the castle of the Counts of Flanders at the intersection of the Lya and the river Lieve, which goes off-screen to the west. Here you can see the castle of the Counts of Flanders, the Château des Comtes. This was built in the 12th century by Philippe d'Alsace, the son of the Count of Flanders who brought back the Holy Blood that we heard about in Bruges. This was built about a century before the famous castles of Edward I in Wales, which we saw earlier this quarter. But it's pretty impressive. This is where John of Ghent, or Gaunt, John of Gaunt as he's known in England, was born after the Battle of Sluis, about which we heard earlier this quarter. Here it is now inside. Unlike some castles, this one has not been restored in any romantic way, and it still has a pretty grim atmosphere about it, which is added to by the Museum of Instruments used for torture on display in it. There are narrow winding stone staircases, and I've seen both rats and bats in the place. Here you can see the belfry attached to the old cloth hall in the center of town. It was the headquarters, the cloth hall of the Clothing Manufacturers Guild here in the Middle Ages. The belfry is actually older than the cloth hall itself, though. It was erected in the 14th century and the cloth hall was built in the 15th. Here you can see now the surviving old buildings along the quays of the Lya River, the oldest of which is the 12th century grain warehouse at the right. Although all of Flanders was nominally under the lordship of the Counts of Flanders, who were also Dukes of Burgundy from Philip the Bold's day to the death of his great-grandson Charles the Bold in 1477, places like Bruges and Ghent were really more like independent city-states in the manner of Florence and Siena than parts of a whole, and felt little political loyalty to each other. The most important painter to spend a long time in Ghent was Hugo van der Goes. Van Eyck, of course, painted the Adoration of the Lamb for the cathedral, but it's unlikely he lived in the city for any length of time. Van der Goes was probably born in Ghent and was in any case in the Painters Guild there by 1467. The Blue Guide to Belgium inexplicably doesn't even mention him in connection with the city. Despite this bizarre omission, Van der Goes' Portinari altarpiece is now considered to rank with Van Eyck's own Ghent altarpiece and Van der Weyden's Prado Descent among the very greatest Flemish pictures of the 15th century. Here you see the left wing of this altarpiece, now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It's in Florence because it was commissioned in about 1475 by Tommaso Portinari, who was the Medici agent in Bruges, where he lived in the Palais Blédelin, which we saw last time. He had it made for the chapel of the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, which was founded by his distant ancestor, Folco Portinari, and if you were in the Italian Renaissance class, you should remember that Folco was the father of Donni's Beatrice. You can see Tommaso kneeling in front of his patron saint, Thomas, and behind him is St. Anthony, who, as I mentioned in connection with Van der Weyden's bone altarpiece we saw earlier, is often associated with hospitals. Tommaso loaned way too much money to Charles the Bold, and was left holding the bag when the latter was killed at the Battle of Nancy, a couple of years after this picture was painted. Here's the central panel of the work now. The subject is the Adoration of the Shepherds at the Nativity, which was more popular in the north than the Adoration of the Magi, the Epiphany, which was more popular in Italy. The Nativity may actually have been chosen as the subject because the hospital for which the work was intended was dedicated to the Virgin, and she's perhaps a more important actor at the Nativity than at Epiphany. Some things about this picture are easy to criticize. It is hard, for example, to tell whether the Virgin is supposed to be standing or kneeling. The baby Jesus looks forlorn lying on the floor with hardly even any straw under him, like a kind of alien presence no one really knows what to do with. And the angels at the lower right don't even seem to be looking at him, despite their attitudes of adoration. Despite these things, however, there's no doubt that this picture, this altarpiece, is one of the most powerful of the whole Renaissance. This is in part due, as is the case with Van der Weyden's Prado Descent, in part due to its size. It's about 8 feet high, and the whole altarpiece is about 17 feet wide. And combined with this size is a kind of rugged realism of a sort not seen in most 15th century Italian painting. This is especially true of the treatments of the shepherds. Here you can see them up closer. I've mentioned idealized ugliness before, and I think this is another example of it. These fellows are straight off the farm and are clearly meant to look like the peasants they are. But Van der Gogh's treatment of them, the glow of their adoration and humanity, makes them more impressive than the pretty little angels he seems to have stuck on the picture as an afterthought. In 1478, when he was probably still in his 30s, Van der Goghs entered an Augustinian monastery, and in 1481 he began to suffer from what is described as religious melancholia and died insane the next year. Some profess to see signs of mental instability in this altarpiece, but there's nothing in it that would lead any sensible person to suppose the man who painted it was on the verge of insanity with no other evidence. Notice the two midwives at the left who were also popular in northern representations of the Nativity, and we saw them earlier in the Nativity by Robert Campin. At the bottom of the picture is this beautiful detail which is full of symbols important in the context, but which could pass as a de facto still life of a sort that wouldn't become popular for another century and a half. The grapes on the vase and the wheat represent the Eucharist, of course, the red lilies the blood of Christ, the spear-shaped leaves of the iris, the spear that pierced Christ's side, the 7 dark blue blossoms of the Aquilegia, the 7 sorrows of the Virgin, and the clear glass vase represents the Virgin herself. As glass allows light to pass through it without being altered, so the Virgin is the vessel which receives the Incarnation without having her status as a virgin altered. Here is the right-hand panel of the altarpiece now. Tommaso Portinari's wife, Maria Magdalena Baroncelli, kneels at the lower left, with her namesake, Mary Magdalene, at the right, and St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, between them. Margaret is the patroness of childbirth because she was swallowed by a dragon and then spat out, and I guess that was thought to be roughly analogous to childbirth. The dragon below her is her attribute. Maria's daughter, Margaret, beside her, was named for this saint, and it may well be that her birth was difficult. Maria looks like an old woman here, but was only in her 20s when this was painted. Her daughter was born when she was 15. Maria's maiden name, Baroncelli, may ring a bell with some of you who were in the Italian Renaissance class. Bernardo Bandini Baroncelli was the fellow who assassinated Giuliano de' Medici the year this picture arrived in Florence, 1478.
And Maria was his cousin, but neither she nor Tommaso were implicated in the assassination plot, although Tommaso did later fall out with the Medici and die in 1501 a pauper in the hospital his ancestor Folco had founded, and in the chapel of which his altarpiece was on display. Maria had predeceased him in 1490 in her 30s after having had 10 children.
On the left you can see the Magi making their way along. And here's that part of the picture up closer. They'll arrive in 12 days on Epiphany, or Twelfth Night as the English call it, January 6th. And this is one of the more meteorologically correct of such pictures. It really does look like it could be January here. This is the Calvary Triptych by Justus van Gent, or Jus van Gent, now in the crypt of St. Bavo's in Ghent, the same church where we saw Van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb. Jus van Gent is a far less important artist than Van der Goes, but he was a friend of his and sponsored his admission to the Ghent Painters Guild. I should say that this altarpiece is sometimes attributed to Hugo van der Goes himself. This is not considered an especially significant altarpiece, but it can be used to make an important point about subject matter. The center of the picture is of course occupied by the crucifixion, and the important point I want to make is that all altarpieces do have New Testament or post-New Testament subjects as their main subjects. When we see Old Testament subjects, as here, they are relegated to the wings and are often chosen, as here again, because they are thought to foreshadow New Testament events. On the left side, we see Moses using a long stick to miraculously purify the poisonous well of Marah during the Exodus. And on the right, we see him holding up the staff with the bronze serpent, looking upon which cured the Hebrews of their snake bites. Both of these episodes were thought to foreshadow the saving power of the cross itself, and such episodes are called typologies. This is the Danzig altarpiece now by Hans Memling. It was actually commissioned by Angelo Tani, who was Tommaso Portinari's predecessor as the Medici agent in Bruges. The altarpiece was sent back to Italy by ship, but the ship was attacked by pirates and taken to Danzig, or Gdansk as it's now known in Poland, where the altarpiece still is. It is said that Portinari, rather than Tani, appears in the left balance pan among the saved, the one on Michael's right. But I don't know why this would be. The fellow does look like him, though. Notice that in this picture he's among the saved, but his side of the balance goes down. Memling was a pupil of Van der Weyden, and this certainly reminds me of the central motif of the latter's bone altarpiece, but for some reason Memling changed the significance of up and down. This is Memling's Kidwelly altarpiece now in the London National Gallery. It was probably painted during the sojourn in Bruges of Sir John Donne, who kneels at the left front. He was one of the English noblemen who escorted Edward IV's sister Margaret to Bruges for her marriage to Charles the Bold in 1468. The two St. Johns in the wings are obviously there because John has their name, but his wife's name was Elizabeth and his daughter was Anne, so why St. Catherine is at the left here and St. Barbara at the right isn't clear. Until the 20th century, Memling was usually regarded as the greatest of the so-called Flemish primitives, and in the old 11th edition Britannica he gets as much space as Van Eyck. His reputation has gone down, though, in the last few decades. His work is called mawkish, sentimental, effeminate, pretty, and H.W. Jansen leaves him out of his history of art altogether, which I think is uncalled for. It's thought that we see a self-portrait of him behind that column in the left panel. Here he is then up closer, and I have to admit he doesn't look much like a genius. The wedding of Charles and Margaret was incidentally quite an affair. The guests are said to have eaten a whole whale, and a chorus of trained goats performed a motet. This is a portrait of an unknown subject by Memling in the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague. I don't see anything mawkish or sentimental here. Walter Friedlander says that his style is one of roses without thorns, but this guy looks a little thorny to me, or at least prickly. And this is Memling's portrait of a woman who was probably Maria Morel, the daughter of Guillaume Morel, the burgomaster of Bruges at the time the picture was painted. And this is Memling's portrait of Guillaume Morel himself, who was one of Memling's most important clients. In addition to this and the portrait of his daughter we just saw, he also commissioned the Morel triptych, now in the Groningen Museum in Bruges. Here's the way that altarpiece looks, with Morel and his 5 sons in the panel at the left, along with Saint Guillaume de Meneval, an obscure soldier hermit saint, but there aren't many Saint Guillaumes, Williams in English, to choose from if that's your name. In the right panel is his wife Barbara, with her patron Saint Barbara, identifiable by her tower attribute, and their 11 daughters. To have 16 children survive infancy was quite an accomplishment in an age during which it's been estimated that as many as 1 in 5 births resulted in the death of the mother. St. Christopher is in the middle of the central panel, along with St. Maurice, given credit for introducing the Benedictine order into France, on the left, and St. Gilles, St. Giles, on the right. Giles was hit by a hunter's arrow while protecting his pet deer, which is his attribute in the picture. We'll see this all in some more detail now, and hear more of the Mass Au Travail Suisse, the I'm Hard at Work Mass by
Johannes Ockeghem.
This is the former hospital of St. John in Bruges, which now houses the Memling Museum. Memling himself was a member of the Hospitallers Order, founded back at the time of the Crusades and known in his day as the Knights of Rhodes. The order still survives and is popularly known now as the Knights of Malta. He apparently did spend some time in residence here, but he is also known to have owned a large house in which he lived in some luxury as one of the wealthiest citizens in Bruges. This museum has several important things by Memling and other artists, including his famous St. Ursula shrine. Here's that shrine now, commissioned by Jan Florijns, the governor of the hospital at the time. This is actually a reliquary said to hold, or to have once held, some of the bones of St. Ursula and her virgin companions. For the darker part of the Middle Ages, say roughly 500 to 1000, reliquaries are perhaps the most representative objet d'art. In the Renaissance, however, though such things were still made, few people we now consider important artists made any. The story of St. Ursula is one of the more bizarre in Christian tradition, and yet she was among the most popular saints. According to the story, she was a British princess who was to marry a prince and wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Rome first, taking 11,000 fellow virgins with her. The Pope was so impressed when he met them that he decided to accompany them all back to Britain. And here you see them getting on boats at Basel to go down the Rhine. When they arrived at Cologne, however, they were massacred by Huns. And here you see the death of St. Ursula herself. As most of you who have attended these lectures for a while will remember, the 13th century book by Jacobus de Voragine, the Bishop of Genoa, known as the Golden Legend, was the primary source for such traditions as this, but the modern emphasis on what a picture looks like rather than what its subject is has led this book to be all but forgotten. Okay, that's where we'll take the break. After intermission, we'll hear about Gerard David, the last important painter in Bruges, and then we'll go on to follow the adventures of Charles the Bold and Louis XI.